Hello, and welcome to the 26th Annual Vermont Grazing and Livestock Conference. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, to bring special attention to the National Grazing Lands Coalition, Food Animal Concerns Trust, Morrison's Custom Feeds, Rural Vermont, and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. Please visit all of our sponsors' virtual booths for more information about their work. I'd also like to thank our partners. They help make our work possible throughout the year. The National Institute of Food and Agriculture, United States Department of Agriculture, Cedar Tree Foundation, and the Forrest C. and Francis H. Latner Foundation. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about how to use Whova to improve your conference experience. During the sessions, we will take Q&A from the audience. You will submit your Q&A questions under the Q&A tab to the right of the session recording. If you blow the session recording up to full screen, you will lose the tabs to your right. So just remember that you'll have to minimize them, the screen, when you have a question in order to put your question in the Q&A tab. You can also see other attendees' questions. This allows the upvoting of questions to increase the likelihood that they will get asked and answered. There is a chat tab here. This is for you and other attendees to share your wisdom. We will also use it to post resources from the presentations. And you will also find the live captioning link here in the chat tab. For the live captioning of each session, you will cut and paste that link into a new browser window. Please use Google Chrome as your browser. There's also a polls tab and a community board tab. The polls tab will help you provide feedback to the presenters. And the community board will allow you to connect with other attendees. There are a number of networking features within Whova that helps you connect to other attendees. One new feature is the speed networking sessions. We will be hosting one speed networking session on the 22nd from 11:30 to 12:30. This is an opportunity for farmers to sit together and chat at a virtual table. Every 10 minutes, you will be shuffled to a new virtual table, but you'll have a chance to introduce yourself and say hello to new and old friends. You can also email, text, or video call other attendees. You can do this for the next 6 months. For the next 6 months, you can host a virtual meetup or create a discussion group on topics of your choice. Again, please use Google Chrome as your browser, and you have this capability for the next 6 months. Did I mention that you can host a virtual meetup or start a topic discussion group? So this is under your community tab on the left. And there are a number of features where you can start to network with people who have similar questions to your questions. Thank you for participating and spending the time with us for the 26th Annual Vermont Grazing and Livestock Conference. I hope you enjoy the content.
Hello and welcome. I'm Megan Sheridan. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Grass Farmers Association. And this afternoon, it is my pleasure to introduce Joshua Faulkner to talk about the pasture-related research that's happening at UVM. Just a really quick reminder about a few things using Whova. One, the Q&A, just get your questions into the Whova Q&A. Those of you who are only on Zoom, we will cut and paste your questions out there, because when Joshua's done, if we haven't gotten to every single question, we can get him to answer those questions after the fact. So important, and plus the voting happens on Whova of upvoting questions. So they're most likely to get answered. Then the chat tab is where you'll find the closed captioning. And Joshua has polls for us. So if you look at the polls tab, there are 4 poll questions in there. There are 2 that are in the beginning, your attitude, your thoughts before the session, and then there are 2 that are like after the session. So to provide feedback to Joshua, if you would please pay some attention and answer those that are in the polls tab. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Joshua.
Thanks, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. Really good to be here back at the Grazing conference. Wish we were in person, I'm sure, as we all do, but it's good to be here nonetheless. I work within the Center for Sustainable Agriculture, which is part of UVM Extension. I'm the Farming and Climate Change Program Coordinator there and have been for 8.5 years now. Do a lot of work on soil and water resources and collaborate a lot with partners across UVM and New England on pasture related research. So I'm going to share my screen and talk about a couple projects today. Okay, let me minimize this so I can see what I'm doing here. All right, and so please let me know if you can't see that, or let Megan know, but I'm assuming you can. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to talk about a couple projects. The first one being a project that was done with the University of Maine and the Northeast Climate Hub. And this was a project titled Climate Adaptation Resources for Northern New England Farmers. And just quickly, I do want to acknowledge my co-conspirators on this. There was quite a gang of us from UVM, faculty, graduate students, and some undergrads who also helped along the way, and then a really strong team from University of Maine as well, and Aaron Lane from the Northeast Climate Hub. So this was, we had a lot of cooperators on this, and I think produced a really nice project. I will just reiterate what Megan said. There are just a couple pre-session poll questions on this portion of my presentation. I will move into another. I'm going to spend about half the time on this project and half the time on another project, but please take just a minute and answer those poll questions for me if you would, and then there's going to be some post-session poll questions, and this helps us judge just the effectiveness of the materials that we've created. So project overview for this. Just as a kind of a statement, problem statement, climate change, I think, as we are all aware, is shaping up to be one of the greatest environmental threats to the world. And in our specific context as farmers, it is poised to have significant impacts on U.S. agriculture if we do not adapt. As a result of this, there is certainly an increased focus on the development of climate resources and information from our land-grant universities and others to help farmers and agricultural stakeholders plan for climate change and adapt their enterprises and their systems to climate change. Having said that, there are resources being developed, but there seems to be a lack of resources for small and medium-sized farms, beginning farms and farmers, especially within New England and within the context that New England farmers face. So that kind of set the stage for us. And the goal of this project was to create some tools and resources that were specifically tailored for the farms within Northern New England, and to fill that gap in knowledge and resources. So that's what we tried to do with this project, at least kind of chip away at that gap. This was a 3-phase project. The first phase was interviews. The second phase was focus groups. And the third phase is where the rubber really met the road. And that was the development of some tools and resources for farmers, farmer-facing tools, being an economic tool and some visualizations. And we did this for 3 different practices that are being utilized within New England: silvopasture, irrigation, and tarping. I'm going to focus just on silvopasture today because we're at the Grazing conference, but then I'll give you the website address at the end. And if you're a diversified farm or have an interest, you can go check out the resources for irrigation and tarping for vegetable systems as well. So what I want to do now is just walk through each of those 3 phases and tell you what we did for this project. The first phase was the interview phase. And for this, we interviewed 33 small to medium scale farmers in Maine and Vermont, as well as 16 outreach professionals or ag service providers, extension folks who are providing services to farms and farmers. And really, we knew that successful climate adaptation by our farmers would depend upon communication between our service providers and our farmers, and that communication is really framed and informed by the values and the perceptions that farmers hold and that ag service providers hold. And so part of the team, the social scientists on the team, and this is why I love working with social scientists, they bring some really cool tools and skills to the table. They developed these mental models of each of the individuals, each of the farmers and each of the extension agents that was interviewed, about how they see how they conceive of their agricultural enterprise and their system. And it's just fascinating tool and just really helps bring some things to light. I'm showing one of those mental models on the right-hand side of the screen that belongs, if you will, to a Vermont beef farmer. And just to quickly explain how these work, if you start at let's start at the upper left-hand corner of that mental model. We have boxes of different components within different things they're important within the production system according to that individual. And if there's an orange arrow leading from the box with a negative symbol, that has a negative symbol on the next box that it connects to. If there's a blue arrow leading from that box with a positive sign, it has a positive effect on the box that the arrow connects it to. So if we look at low availability of butcher dates, that has a negative effect on good timing of bringing product to market. That then in turn has a negative effect on producing healthy food for our community. So there's kind of this compounding effect as we think about what affects what and how does that affect something else on down the line. Another example, access to manure. This farmer believed it has a positive effect on healthy soils. That has a positive effect on healthy pastures, and that has a positive effect on healthy cattle. So you kind of see how everything within the mental model of a farmer or a service provider is related. This was a really interesting exercise, and I think the key results, we found 3 key differences between the mental models of farmers and agricultural service providers. One is that farmers mentioned community well-being, public education, and farm success significantly more than agricultural service providers did. Farmers also felt that quality of life, community well-being, and environmental stewardship and farm success were much more influential in their mental model than they were in the ag service providers model. And then really at the core of this project, ag service providers, their mental model showed that climate was a direct driver of yields on the farm and product quality on the farm, where farmers actually believed that that was much more indirect. So important information for us to consider as we went about our work, and was really helped lay the groundwork for our resources. Phase 2 of this was the focus group phase. And this is where we we kind of went beyond what we did within the interviews, and we gathered groups of farmers and asked them questions about, well, what resources are you most interested in seeing? What resources are most needed to help you and your farm and your farming system adapt to climate change? We did several focus groups across New England. We would have loved to have done more. This part of the project, unfortunately, was interrupted by the pandemic. Couldn't gather in focus groups as much as we'd like, but we did get what we felt was a meaningful number of focus groups with 28 participants. And good input on what resources would be most valuable to the farmers. Then we took all this information back to our working groups, reviewed it, dug into what extension literature is currently available, what peer-reviewed literature is currently available, and started to identify what key resources we could actually develop for farmers, how those matched up with what farmers needed, and then informed those resources by what is already existing out there. And we did that. I mentioned this. We did that for 3 specific practices. We did that for silvopasture. We did that for irrigation. We did that for tarping in vegetable systems. Now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to try to do this smoothly, and I'm going to transition to the website that we developed as part of this project, which houses all of the information, the tools, and the resources for each of those practices. And so hopefully you can see this. Megan, please let me know if you can't see this. But this website, nefarmclimate.com, just launched less than 48 hours ago, and it's I would say final form. We might need to tweak a few things. I'm sure there might be a typo or two in there somewhere, but we feel like this is a fairly final draft. And if you go here, you'll see at the top we have about the project. I kind of gave you all the kind of the short story there. And then you'll see an option to pick practices. For us, let's go to Silvopasture. We're going to go to a Silvopasture page. And then there's a definition of silvopasture, basic kind of description of what silvopasture is. Silvopasture is, well, let me just quickly define it here for those who may not know. It's an agroforestry system that combines well-managed woodlands and pastures to generate both livestock and forest products on the same parcel of land. So it's a combination of raising livestock and tree products, so trees or tree products on the same piece of land. There's two kind of two major categories of how someone might, 2 major ways, let me say, of how someone would approach silvopasture. One would be pasture enhancement, and that's where we take an existing pasture that already has livestock in it and we add trees to it. The other one would be forest thinning, and that's where we take a forest, we remove some trees, and then we add livestock. We focused on the first, the pasture enhancement, because of existing NRCS programs that could potentially provide financial and technical assistance for pasture enhancement, but would not for forest thinning, and because of some of the issues that we, especially in Vermont, see around how a practice of forest thinning might not fit within the current current rules that govern the current use tax laws. So we felt like this pasture enhancement was really the way to go, and what we chose to focus on with our review of the literature and what is out there. So for each practice, we go through the common components in silvopasture within the Northeast. Common tree species are listed there on the the leftmost column. Oaks, maples, fruit trees, eastern white pine, hickories, eastern hemlock, nut trees, black locust. We found instances of all of these being used in the Northeast. Forest products that can come from those trees include firewood, saw timber, fence posts, scion wood, fruit, nuts, maple sap, tree nursery, or just a tree nursery. Excuse me. And then livestock species that have been used in the Northeast: cattle, goats, pigs, sheep, chicken, turkeys, horses, kind of everything, that you can think of. And then a list of all the forages that are commonly used within silvopasture in the Northeast. So this is kind of a cheat sheet for someone thinking about doing silvopasture. We then produced what we heard in our focus groups is that with practices that lead to a really kind of a dramatic change in the landscape, some farmers just had trouble visualizing what that might look like on the land. And so working with a visualization specialist, someone who does this professionally, we developed some visualizations that allow you to use a slider and advance in time from before when trees are planted to when trees are first planted at a 17 to 21 basal density, which would be a common tree planting density in the Northeast, to when you have mature trees at 20 years. So this is kind of a really neat tool for someone like myself who's a very visual learner and likes to be able to look at images of things before they dive in. We have several visualizations. We also have, some of these are aerial visualizations. Here is one where it's the same. This is with black walnut trees after 40 years of growth, and you can kind of see how they would fill in a pasture. The one on the right is with thinning that has occurred within that pasture, taking out some of those trees. Here's one with sheep in planting, integrating apple trees within that sheep pasture. So just kind of little cool toys to fool around with. And I won't, the last one is very similar to the aerial view of the black walnut. We then reviewed all of the again, through reviewing the literature, silvopasture literature in the Northeast, we then identified key benefits and key costs that really rise to the surface, and those are listed here. Benefits of silvopasture include improved animal performance because of the increased shelter and shade. Animals within silvopasture systems get a very diversified diet compared to the standard pasture, and that can be a benefit. Diversified farm products and income can come from a silvopasture system. The list, there's several more within this list. I'm not going to read them all to you. You can see them there on your screen and then go back later and investigate. But then, improve soil health, carbon sequestration because of the woody biomass that's being produced on that land. And then the costs associated with silvopasture, or the risks associated with silvopasture. Certainly a different environment for livestock. Livestock can be exposed to potentially toxic plants, predators, parasites, diseases, physical hazards. Even in there was note of hunters in the Northeast and some risk there. One of the biggest costs and risks, I think, in the Northeast that we found is that there's generally a lack of institutional knowledge, if you will. It's not as if There are, every other farm driving down a country road is doing silvopasture. So there's not this network of farms and farmers that is widespread. There are certainly farms and farmers that are doing this, but it hasn't infiltrated out into all of our farming communities. So it's in some cases can be difficult to find knowledge, especially local knowledge on what works and what doesn't. And then finally, not finally, we have one more thing after this. We developed an economic tool for silvopasture. And what you're looking at right now is the final graph that the economic tool produces with the years of the project, or the years of to maturity, or not to maturity, the years in which all the trees would be harvested on the x-axis, and then the revenue on the y-axis. And you can see that the annual revenue, the annual cost, the annual profit, and the cumulative revenue are all plotted on that chart, on that figure. Now, for your own situation, you can open the calculator and make changes that are tailored to your particular enterprise. And kind of tweak certain values if you know them to be different than the default values. You can change the length of the project. You can change the acreage within the project. We have some of the generally accepted default values, like the discount rate is listed here. That this is typical for agricultural financial analyses. All the default values are filled in, but then you can go through, of course, and change the ones that you feel like you can put a little bit finer point on, or just change them for your particular situation. Beside a lot of these inputs, we do have an information bubble, and you can hover over that and learn more about that input, or where that default value came from. We gleaned a lot of these from other extension publications or published literature, so on and so forth. You can make the changes, and then you'll actually see like I'll change trees per acre. I'll say I'll plant 60 trees per acre, and I don't know if you noticed, the figure then changes real time to adjust your revenue, cost, profit, and cumulative revenue. If you want to see the actual values and not look at them in a figure, you can open it as a table as well. And for each year, you can see the individual values for revenue, cost, value, and cumulative revenue. Okay,
Josh, I have a question that came in,
Yep.
or actually a couple of them that actually relate to the page that you were just on, with the benefits and the costs. And the question is, how deep does that go? Like, if you're looking at the costs and the benefits, can you click onto those, a specific cost or benefit? There, oh yeah, there you go. And does it go deeper into what it is?
So it currently does not. We have these set up as live links, but we don't currently have them linked to that specific resource. That's a great question. But what I will say, if you scroll down, we have all of the resources that we relied upon down here at the bottom of the page. So even we've distilled out that information from these resources and some others, but within each of these resources, you could find, you could track back to that benefit or that cost, but we have not yet done that. I'll say that.
Okay, and then another question, which I don't know whether you want to get into this or not, so let me know, is someone had a question about under one of the costs. Keep scrolling the other way. Go other way.
Oh, okay.
Scroll back up. Yeah. Here they Water retention was their question. And so I don't know that you want to get into the details. The question is, you mentioned less water retention and
Yep.
quality as a cost. Do you want to talk about that kind of stuff? Someone
Sure.
wanted you to elaborate on that? Okay.
Yeah, quickly I can. That's a really good question, because if you notice, improved water retention and quality shows up as a benefit, but decreased water retention and quality shows up as a cost. And this is one of, we all know that management matters, right? It's not just all silvopasture systems are not created equal, that if it's a poorly managed silvopasture system, we could actually see decreased water retention and quality. But if it's a really well-managed silvopasture system, we could see improved water retention and quality. So I'll say that the management matters within, within the spectrum of silvopasture systems.
Super,
And there's
thanks.
been instances of both of that occurring. Good. Okay. All right. So where was I? Let's see. We were finishing up the economic tool. And then I was just at the bottom of the page here, we have a lot of other cool resources on silvopasture that are well worth exploring. We kind of curated these. I think they're all really, really useful, high quality resources. There's some virtual tours and videos, fact sheets, guides, and overviews, and then some other resources that didn't quite fit within one of those other buckets. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing my website and I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint and see if I can get back to my slide I was on. I had these in PowerPoint just in case I had problems with the website, but the website worked great, so didn't need to use those slides. So for silvopasture, I encourage you to visit the website, nefarmclimate.com. I think pretty easy to remember. We were lucky we were able to get that address and make use of those resources, and email me and others on the website if you choose to, and give us some feedback. Quickly, acknowledgements for this project. It's supported by USDA, a NIFA project under the award number there at the top. And again, really great grant team led by Meredith Niles at UVM and lots of other folks at UVM, University of Maine, and the Climate Hub. And then our visualizations were done by Holly Greenleaf, and our website design was by Tim Harold at UVM. Okay. And then photo credits here. Got to make sure we get that in there. Really good photos. Okay, so we're about halfway through, and that's perfect. We're right on time. I now want to transition to woodchip pad wintering areas. And I've presented on these several times at the Grazing conference in the past, but have not done so for probably 2 or 3 years. So just want to provide an update on one of the most recent projects we did, worked on, which was actually in northeastern Pennsylvania. And it's a project that did an incredible job of documenting the process, documenting the build, and they've done a really good job of monitoring performance and water quality and water absorption and so on and so forth in that system. So I just want to try to highlight that, share some of their photos and some of their findings today. For those of you who are not familiar with woodchip, woodchip pads or woodchip wintering areas, just briefly, these are basically barnyards that are constructed with a woodchip surface. We built the first one of these in the United States in northern West Virginia over 10 years ago. Built several in the mid-Atlantic, and then when I came to Vermont, I found a lot of farmers were interested in these as well, and they've really been kind of a really good, I think, a great fit for Vermont scale livestock farms. And given that we have such a tremendous mud season in Vermont, and a significant winter period. These are areas where we can bring cattle in off pasture to avoid pasture damage. Feed cattle either, preferably not on the wood chips themselves, but off to the side in a feeding bunk or a feeding barn. And then the wood chip surface provides a really firm, stable, well-drained surface for the cattle to lay on and to loaf on. There's been research in the UK and Ireland that shows improved weight gain of cattle, beef cattle on these pads. And they're just, I think they also have a lot of water quality benefits. They absorb a lot of incoming precipitation versus a concrete barnyard. And they also bind up a lot of nutrients within the manure. And then those nutrients are captured, can be composted with wood chips that are scraped off the surface in the springtime, composted, and then field applied and utilized by forage. Just quickly, the typical profile or section of a wood chip pad looks like this. This is a design drawing of a typical design drawing of many of the wood chip pads we've built. You go in where you want your barnyard to be, excavate down about 2.5 feet. On the subgrade in the bottom of that excavation, you shape a ridge and valley type form into the subgrade. In the valleys, you place perforated pipe drainage tile, and then you backfill over top of that with 18 inches of drainage stone. So you have about 18 inches over the pipe in the valleys, and you have about 12 inches of stone over top of the ridges, if you will. And that helps protect the pipe from crushing when you're driving heavy equipment over that stone before you place the final 12 inches of wood chips on top of that stone. The wood chips that we recommend to be used are a screened wood chip. We like to get the largest wood chip that you can find. Really lucky here in Vermont, New Hampshire, I think that we have mills that are producing what they call a bowl chip. That is a screened chip. It's a large chip. It's used for heating in some industrial applications, and it's a very affordable chip as well. And it's easy to get and to bring in. I do not recommend using wood chips from power line cuttings and such, because they have so much small particles, bark and leaf material in it that it will tend to clog up. We have, to my knowledge, there's been over 10 wood chip pads constructed in the Northeast over the past 5 to 6 years. They've been built on beef farms, dairy farms, bison farms, a lot of interest from horse owners. I've yet to know of one that has been built on a horse farm, but lots of calls. Been lots of, and these are the chip pads we know of. I receive calls all the time from folks all over the country interested in wood chip pads and wanting to know, tips and tricks on how to build them. They've been funded by agencies. NRCS has accepted them into their cost share programs. The Vermont Agency of Agriculture has too, but then also farms are also building them on their own dime too. So it works both ways. And now, again, like I said, just want to highlight a wood chip pad in northeastern PA. This was a 50-head cow-calf operation. It's a 100-acre farm that rotationally grazes their cattle, and they designed the wood chip pad for about 200 square feet per brood cow. Our design guidance here has been about 110 square feet per cow, and that's worked fairly well. This farm had the resources to build a little bit larger area per cow, and so they went ahead and did that. And I think that's great if you can do that. If you compare that to concrete, the standard, for concrete is 75 square feet per cow. So it kind of gives you a frame of reference of the footprint differences that you might see. And so just, we're going to go through a photo tour here. This is construction of that wood chip pad after they've excavated down to the subgrade. You can see a little bit of that ridge and valley formation in the subgrade. And then they've laid down geotextile on top of the subgrade before they put down their perforated pipe. That geotextile is just gives the soil some additional strength so that when you traffic that gravel with heavy equipment, it prevents losing your gravel into the subgrade, pushing your gravel into the subgrade. It adds quite a bit of strength there. Perforated, the pipes are placed at 10-foot spacing. All of those laterals that go out underneath the pad all tie into a header or a main at the foot of the pad that collects all of the water from those pipes. And then that water is directed into a holding area because even though we bind up a lot of the nutrients within the wood chip media, it can be fairly rich at times in terms of nutrients. So this definitely is not allowed to run off site unchecked. And I'll show you what they had a really innovative solution here at this site for what they did with their water, which I'll show you in a few minutes. What we found is that in the last several pads that we've built, we've put in cleanouts. This is a newer feature for us. So at the end of the laterals, outside of the fence line, we'll turn up an elbow and bring a clean out pipe up to the surface and cap it with a screw plug, so that if we do get clogging within that drainage pipe, we can open that and then jet water through there and hopefully blow out any clogging that occurs. And they did that here at this site as well. Here's just another image of the stone going in over top of the geotextile and all the perforated pipe. We're moving right along here in construction now. And here's the first day. Chips would go on. 12 inches of chips went on after that stone. And here's the first day of stocking in December 30th, 2018. And then here's an aerial view of that pad that they were able to take with a drone. This is confinement day number 108 in April of 2019. And you can see the pad is there in the center of your screen, the large brown square, obviously. And then there's a small square attached to it on the upper side of it. That is the manure storage bunk, and that's where the composting of the wood chips occur. And then along the right side of the pad, I really like this feature. This is a feed bunk that allows the farmer to feed from outside of the fence line, and then to enter into that feed alley with a bucket on a tractor or a skid steer and scrape out all the manure and put it into that manure storage holding bunk. The cattle deposit about 2/3 of their manure in and around where they're eating, so most of the manure is deposited on a concrete feed alley so it can be scraped out. And then of course any manure that gets deposited out on the pad stays there until spring clean out. You'll see in this site, this was a fairly high risk site because it was close to this flowing stream, just literally just 40 or 50 feet away from that. Where this blue dot is here on the bottom of the pad, that is where there's a loading chute, a squeeze chute and a loading chute. And right in that area is also a 2,000-gallon septic tank that we collect all of the runoff off of the pad and the feed bunk and the manure storage bunk, or not the feed bunk, the feed alley, I should say. Collected in there, and then there's a pump system that pumps it into through a pipe that goes underneath the stream and across into some fields for distribution over there. And I have a great shot of that as well. Here we are, confinement day 109, getting into the spring now. Still really nice footing for these cattle to be confined on a 100-foot by 100-foot area all winter. they are not sinking. It's nice and stable, very comfortable laying down. The farmer just beamed about how clean his cattle stayed after being on this pad all winter. Here's a shot of them on confinement day number 122. Grass is starting to get green, but not quite ready to release them out yet. And I do have this really neat time-lapse video of the winter stocking period that I would like to show to you. It's about 1 minute 45 seconds, about 2 minutes. So let me try to, I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to open that video in a website. And then I'm going to reshare. Lots of Zoom acrobatics going on here. Okay, hopefully, whoop. All right, hopefully you can see that. This is, yeah, about 2 minutes, but it's the entire winter period. You can see there's fresh wood chips down there, starting to get dirtier and dirtier, getting into January and winter time. What's interesting at this pad is he said the cows always went back to the same spot on the pad to lay down. They kind of had little nests formed, and they just love to be in those very specific spots all winter long. You can see here's a rainstorm. It's starting to get wet, but there's snow pugging occurring. And then through the day, it drains right through those wood chips and out. Starting to get into March now. Pad still looks really good. Cows still appear fairly clean. Now we're into April. It's all going really quick here. I know. But still no pugging occurring. You know, cows are all still staying up on top into late April. Things are still looking really good. In my opinion, things are looking really good. And now into May. And getting ready to go back out to pasture soon. Mid-May. May 17th, out to pasture. All right, things look really good there coming out of the stocking season, I think. All right, I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint. Just a couple more slides and then we'll stop for, whoa. Hold on just a second. Some technical difficulties here. Okay. Okay. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so here's the wastewater distribution system. So they had a solid set sprinkler, which was designed to pass small solids, so it really could handle that dirty water that was coming through the wood chip pad itself. And they distributed that out onto hay fields and pasture fields when that 2,000 gallon tank filled up. They found that about 73% of the incoming rainfall was collected, ran through the pad. And well, actually, that's not just through the pad, that's off of the feed bunk, which now has the feed alley, which now has a roof on it. So they're no longer collecting that water. But that water also came from that concrete manure storage bunk. In systems where we have not had a feed alley or a manure bunk that was collecting water, we've seen this number be about 50% of incoming precipitation, because the wood chip pads do a very good job of absorbing incoming water and then evaporating that in between storms. So they kind of act like a sponge. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see there's there's dirty chips and manure on top. Then they've dug down into the lower chips, which look very nice and clean, and even into the gravel, which looks very clean. Most of those manure solids, again, are staying up into the upper levels of the chip of the chip pack. Then in the springtime, they scraped off 4 to 6 inches, put that in their manure bunk for composting, and land applied that later in the summer, and then reapplied wood chips in the fall before the stocking season started again. And there's the fresh wood chips going on. In terms of costs, what everybody is interested in the end, this system, which I would call kind of a Cadillac system, a really nice system, ended up being about $3.22 per square foot. Now that's just the chip pad itself. That doesn't include that feeding alley or the manure storage bunk. All systems might not have that. This is just the chip pad itself. And that shook out to be about $645 per animal unit, or roughly per full-size brood cow. And again, that was for a 200 square foot per cow stocking density. If you stocked at 100 square foot per animal unit, that number would be $322 per animal unit. If you compare that to a comparable concrete barnyard for the same size herd, the total cost would be $37,000 total, $9.93 per square foot, and $745 per animal unit. And then on the right side, you can see a table where all the costs are broken out for each of the components of the wood chip pad itself, and for a total of just a little over $32,000. Just for frame of reference, this lines up. The $322, if the stocking density was 100 square foot per animal unit, that matches up fairly well with what we've seen in Vermont for costs for a wood chip pad, upper 200s to around $300. That would match up pretty well with what we've seen. For more information, I would recommend visiting the Bradford County Conservation District website in Pennsylvania. And we also have a lot of resources on our UVM website at the Center for Sustainable Agriculture on this practice. And absolutely always don't hesitate to email me with questions about wood chip pads. I'm glad to answer those. We're going to stop for questions now, but I would just a quick reminder that there are some post-session poll questions that should be within Whova. If you don't mind just taking a quick moment and answering those for me. They are in reference to the Silvopasture resources that we developed, not the wood chip pad portion of the presentation. Now I think that's all I had to say, and it looks like we do have 6 or 7 minutes for questions. I'd love to hear not just questions, but also if you have feedback on input on these projects, or feedback on where you think our research priorities should be going. You know, we're always seeking grant funding to keep ourselves busy and employed. But you know, we want to make sure that our projects are serving you as farmers in the state. So please let us know, you know, what is most highest priority to you, and so we can direct our efforts to meet those needs.
Great, thank you, Joshua. And I just want to reiterate what Joshua said about the polls, because there are 2 additional poll questions out there now. When you first came in, there were only 2. Now there are 4. So please go back in and look at those last 2 questions and answer those. So you were prompted when you came into the webinar to answer 2 questions, and now there are 2 more. And so we don't have a bunch of questions lined up for you, Joshua. But I have a question about the wood chip pad. So the example that you were showing us, I think you said that on an annual basis, they were taking off the chips and
Yep.
putting new chips down. Now, is that the prevailing wisdom now, or are people going through a couple years before they're refreshing the chips?
I recommend every year a refreshment. Now it might just be 2 to 3 inches of, scraping and composting and refreshing. Some farmers have done multiple years. And that seems to work okay. I mean, it is messier the second winter than it is the first winter, but that can work. But my recommendation is to try to replace those every year. That is one thing. With concrete barnyards, you do have much more costs associated with scraping manure from those. It could be multiple times through the year, of course. With wood chip pads, it's really once a year in terms of labor, but there is that cost of wood chips every year if you do a refreshment and kind of top dress. And that can be, we've seen prices on wood chips. Prices on wood chips are pretty variable, especially the time of year you get them. If you get them in the middle of winter when heating demand is high, they're going to be expensive. But if you get them in the off season, you usually get a better deal.
So there is a question now, but over the longevity, concrete versus the wood chip. I mean, you had that first, the construction costs, but on an annual basis, the maintenance cost. Have you done that?
We
cost
haven't
analysis
done
too?
that.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be really good for us to do. We have not done that yet, though. Yeah.
Okay. So now there's a question about wood chip systems using sheep.
Yeah.
Would you still recommend the piping subsystem since the manure is much drier to begin with?
Yeah. So they have been used with sheep in Scotland. I've not seen them in person, but I've spoken to folks and I've seen pictures. So I think it can work. I would still recommend a drainage system because all that water is still running over that. There's a lot of manure that's deposited there on the pad, and even though the manure is fairly solid, it's going to get chopped up by hoof action, and as it rains and snows, you're still going to have a lot of nutrients that would be running down through the pad. So I would still recommend capture of some sort. The state has been, I think fairly reasonable about how water is handled. If you're near a waterway, they would want you to capture that and then handle it like a liquid waste. But there have been cases where if you're a quarter mile from the nearest waterway, you might be able to just distribute that water out onto another pasture or another hayfield. So I think it's a site by site situation, but that water handling can be a big part of the cost if you do have to build a pond, for example, to capture the liquids.
All right, we've got a few more questions here. Are there chips you would not recommend? So there's a couple questions about chips, and I think they're basically trying to get to like what not to get.
Yeah, I would, in terms of species, no, anything works. Yeah, the important thing is that you get the biggest you can get and you get them screened so that you don't have fine particles that will clog them up. Softwood chips, we've done some. Softwood chips are more absorbent, so that's great, but softwood chips degrade quicker than hardwood chips. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. But that's, yeah, all species work great.
And here's a question: what farm challenge are wood chip pads typically used to solve? An overly used heavy use area? What are the types of situations that you recommend a wood chip barnyard versus a bedded pack system?
Yeah, so I mean, I think of those as kind of apples and oranges. They are I'll answer the first question, I guess. So most often used to solve really messy, mucky earthen barnyards. And mud season where cows are up to their udders or beyond in mud, like that's really bad. not just for the cattle, but bad for water quality. So that's where I recommend using this, or where you have pastures that are prone to pugging and wetness, and you just can't protect your pastures, and you need a pressure release valve. You can get those cows off the pasture and put them on a wood chip pad when the pastures are really sensitive. And in terms of comparing it to a bedded pack, you know, I think both are great. I do think it's like a producer preference, you know, and it's a cost thing as well. Bedded packs require management, a lot of management, as do wood chip pads. But I think the upfront cost on a bedded pack would probably be greater. And a lot of people want their cattle to be outside. You know, if they can eat, if they can have shelter from wind, and they can eat under cover, then being outside is where a lot of people want their cattle. So, you know, I think it's a personal preference thing too.
Great. And then there's just an interesting comment that was left on, which was that someone had just finished a wood chip yard last month. They worked with the Agency of Ag to do it. Their specs were a little more specific for them. For instance, they needed to use a custom pond liner underneath. That was about $7,000. But they gave them some leeway on designing the spillway and the drainage. And this person is just wondering, or kind of mentioning, that they think they might have just finished one for a pig farm as well. So,
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So have you seen that multi-species use? No.
No, I have heard, I know of someone who was hoping to get one for pigs, but I don't know the status of it. So this is great to hear. I mean, I think there are other chip pads in the state that I'm not aware of, clearly. So it's really great to hear. And I love to talk to people and just hear how they're working for them. And especially, like, you know, what isn't working for you too. You know, is there something we can address there? Is there some research we need to do to try to improve the functionality of these systems?
This sounds like it's a perfect opportunity for a bus trip. We're gonna have to take like the wood chip pad bus trip around the state and go to all these places.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I work with a researcher from Slovenia actually contacted me, and they have similar size farms there. He's very interested in trying to do this over there, and so he came over this summer, and we did a little tour. I'd love to do it again.
A farmer exchange, like a farmer learning journey. Bring them over here. We get to go over there. Well, this is great, Joshua. Thank you very much for your time. Our time is finished. If people have more questions for Joshua, or think of things, you know, as they're having dinner tonight, you can keep using this Q&A section, so you can put more questions in there, and that'll trigger us to look at them, and we can get answers to folks. So continue to use that. Thank you very much for your time, Joshua. And just as a reminder, there are 2 closing polls. So there are 4. So go answer the last 2 for Joshua. And then we start back tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Sarah Flack. And it's a Q&A session with Sarah Flack. So if it's great right now to start putting your questions for her in the panel. So the whole hour is Q&A. She's got a few opening slides. She's going to talk about grazing resilience in a changing climate. And then, but start thinking of your questions that you want her to answer. It doesn't have to necessarily be about grazing resilience, but we've got Sarah Flack for an hour at 10 o'clock. So please, start thinking, putting your thinking cap on about your questions for her. And then, just as a reminder of something new that we're doing this, I think of it as the virtual lunch table conversation. So it's called speed networking in Hoover, and you have to RSVP to it. It's in the agenda. It's got a little, stand out on its own. Speed networking. We're having the session tomorrow, starting at 11:30 to 12:30. And basically it just keeps shuffling you to a new table with new people. And you'll get to introduce yourself and meet them, and hopefully have a little bit of time for chit chat as 10-minute rotations and groupings of 4 people. So it's new to us, but we're kind of excited about this opportunity to just let people say hi to each other. So please sign up for that. That'd be great. So again, we start back at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody, for spending the time with us, and we will see you tomorrow. Bye, everyone.